Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to a very exciting episode of Absolute Interview with our Absolute Women's Football podcast. Today we're joined by one of the biggest voices in women's football, women's historian and football writer, and such an advocate for change in the sport, Carrie Dunn. Carrie, how are you? Thank you for joining us.
I'm very good. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course, I can never do this by myself. Paul, how are you today?
Very excited about this and chatting to Carrie and prepared for some questions, sweltering gently in the Midlands heat and looking forward to it.
Yeah, Carrie, thank you so much for arranging to spend some time with us this afternoon. Lovely to see you. And as we were just saying before we hit record, there's so many things we want to talk to you about. So it's hard to know where to start. So as a little bit of background, for people who may not be that familiar with you, could you tell us a little bit more about you, please, your involvement within the sporting world, how you got into football in your different sports, please?
Oh, okay. So I guess I'm a bit of a dinosaur, I guess now. I've been writing about women's football for well over 20 years. So it's been a massive time of change since I've been writing about women's football. And I've written about this before, but I think I was kind of a bit of a generational glitch. When I was a kid, there was women's football on the terrestrial television. So I grew up watching women's football on television, or at least knowing that it existed. And I was a big football fan as a kid anyway. But I kind of saw players like Karen Walker and Jill Coulthard and Marianne Spacey on my television when I was when I was a kid. So the way things have changed over the past, probably 35, 40 years is just incredible to me. And yeah, I've been a sports writer, since I've been in the world of work, and I've always been a big advocate and wanted to write about women's sport particularly. And it's been amazing that in the last 5 or 10 years, there have been people who have been able to make a career out of writing up women's football full time and never thought twice about it, because this has been quite a long road. And yeah, so I've kind of dedicated much of my career to chronicling the history of women's football, and that's kind of really what drives me. Going back to what I was saying about Marianne Spacey and Jill Coulthard and Kaz Walker, but of course generations before that too, we've not had these women's stories necessarily written about in the media because there just wasn't the same spotlight, and generations before that and before that and before that. So getting those stories written down and getting their stories better known has been something that's really driven and motivated me in recent years.
I love that. And, I'm so excited for everything else to come to really unpick each of your works and of course, your latest book, which we're here to talk about as well, Flying the Flag. And on your website, while I was looking, amongst all of the incredible things that you have done, there were the words telling stories, chronicling change, and working for change as well, which you've summed up beautifully there. Is that want and need for change and that need to highlight just what these women have been through was something that really inspired your first book, which was The Roar of the Lionesses, of course, and then all of the consequent books, because it has been such a struggle, hasn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned Roar of the Lionesses, and that was 10 years ago I came up with the idea for that. But I'd wanted to write a book about women's football before that, and I was going to publishers and they're just like, it's too niche, people won't buy it. And so after the Canada World Cup in 2015, I came back and I was just like, surely now someone must want to publish a book about women's football. People are watching this on the telly, people will be interested. And fortunately, Pitch Publishing did take the chance on that book, and obviously it's become a trilogy since then. But yeah, I mean, it's just crazy to think like 10 years ago I really had to fight to find a publisher.
Yeah, because if you think about now, we'll talk about the Lionesses a bit more in general soon, but to think that we're having record-breaking crowds and Wembley's being sold out and all of this, incredible attitude towards women's football, it's hard to then think the attitude was even 10 years ago. I mean, we'll give it a go. It's still too niche. But has that been something that was quite therapeutic almost every time you did go back to write another book in the trilogy, that things were changing?
Yeah, and I love to see how stories progress. I never kind of want to kind of just that's the end. Let's just leave it there. And that's something I've tried to do in all three of those Lionesses books, is kind of pick up a thread and take it through. So kind of follow the same teams, or go back to the same player and see how she's doing, because it's never static. It's always changing, particularly in women's football, when things have changed very quickly, very, very rapidly, and very drastically. And it's brilliant that so many new people are coming to the sport for the first time. But then it's also kind of like, 3 years ago, even, this wasn't the same. Things have changed even in that short space of time. So yeah, it's great to be able to kind of write some of these changes out and follow those stories through.
And that leads us quite nicely into June of this year, of course, published your latest book, Flying the Flag, which is about the footballing heroines of the home nations who made history abroad. And I think now, personally, I think, after the Euros, there's so many eyes on women's football, arguably more than ever. Was now the right time to tell this story, because there are so many eyes on women's football? And could you tell us a bit more about the book, of course?
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. Again, this is one that I wanted to write for years. This is probably kind of like 15 years in the making, and this was one that got turned down a lot. Like, no one is interested in these women. They're not famous. They've not been on the telly. They're not going to be the ones with the advertising contracts. These aren't big names. So we've got nothing to hook it on. And no matter how hard I pitched, it wasn't being taken up. But I'm very fortunate that now my publisher, Legend, they were like, yeah, we definitely want to take this. This is the right time to start telling some of these untold stories, because surely that's really exciting. For anyone who loves books or loves stories or loves football, this is exciting. Stories that haven't been told before. These women who grew up in England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and they had footballing ability, and they grew up at a time when professional football, or even a decent standard of football in their country, wasn't necessarily a given. And so these women packed up their lives and went to a different country where they didn't necessarily even know anybody, where they didn't necessarily speak the language, and they weren't always getting paid to play football either. I think that's really important. It wasn't a matter of kind of, they were offered a job, to turn professional, be a professional footballer. It was a choice between being respected and staying at home and not being respected as a footballer. And the fact that these women were so brave and courageous and took that chance, it's really inspiring. I don't even think it's particularly a football story, or these are particularly football stories. Anyone who's interested in incredible stories of incredibly courageous women, that's who this book is written for.
And you've mentioned with it, because you'd kind of written a bit about it in Unsuitable for Females, because you'd had a chapter about people like Sue Lopez who'd gone abroad, and people who'd gone to Italy. And was that where the idea went, yeah, there's a whole book in this, rather than just a chapter?
It was the other way around. I wanted to write about these women who'd gone overseas for, probably 15 years. That's what the book I really wanted to write for a long time. And then Unsuitable for Females, the publisher I've been talking to at the time, were kind of thinking they wanted something that was kind of a more broad history of the women's game, something that's kind of quite wide ranging. So I was like, okay, I can do that. So that's where Unsuitable for Females developed from. And then, kind of this is my little hobby horse. I kind of kept coming back to it. I really wanted to get this book written, and I'm so pleased I finally have.
And we're so pleased you finally have as well. It's been incredible watching all of the research and the stories, and as part of our podcast as well, what we really try and do is not just talk about the top 4 teams in the WSL. We're talking about all of the tiers of women's football. We're talking about the leagues across Europe, because even we were talking a little bit about what's going on particular continents at the minute. It's easy to forget, with how successful and how much England have developed in recent years, how much more there is still to go and still to come. And what impact do you think it had on our footballing talent in the home nations? Did that hinder how should I word this the right way? Do you think that because the talent was then leaving as much as they could seek other opportunities, do you think that hindered the development of the infrastructure in England? Or do you think someone finally took note and said, hang on, we're losing our talent here and there's potential?
Yeah, it was kind of both, really. So one of the reasons the WSL was created, one of the FA's driving forces, was the fact there was this talent drain. They started to realise kind of around just off the turn of the millennium, it was mostly players going off to America, and kind of that being one of the big magnets. The fact that these top England players, these top young talents, were not staying in England. The domestic league was not getting any better. You had this not necessarily particularly competitive top level domestic league, and that was one of the driving forces behind creating the Women's Super League, is to keep the top talent in England. So I guess, yes, I guess the extreme that forced someone to sit up and take notice. But yeah, it was a long time getting those eyes opened and creating the Women's Super League to keep that top talent in the country.
And I know it's a really big question, so please feel free to answer this however you like. Do you think that the change that needs to be made from football federations, are we expecting to see them make monumental shifts quite quickly? Or does it start with even things like, I know you've mentioned before about stop calling women's teams the ladies' teams and stop softening it? Does it start from the bottom with those little ones? Or really, we've got to this point where women's football is at such a high point? Are we expecting federations to make much bigger changes much sooner? Have you got an opinion on?
Yeah,
it's a culture, isn't it?
I think, I guess my concern about the changes we see at the top level of women's football, because of, as you say, this kind of high point, this spotlight on the game, is I think the tendency is for organisations and federations to try and make the women's game as much like the men's game as possible, as quickly as possible, because that's how they understand football. And although that might work at the top level, maybe, I think it doesn't necessarily trickle down. It doesn't necessarily mirror how women's football has historically been organised, or how women's football wants to run below, maybe, as you said, the top 4 teams, maybe. So, give you an example, the Club World Cup idea that people keep banging on about. Okay, fine, if that's what you want to do, but have we not just had this conversation about how packed schedules are, about the fact that this is a guinea pig generation of professional female players? We're not quite sure what the loading is like and the impact that's having on women's bodies at the moment. We're already seeing, the exhaustion in the men's game and the fatigue and the injuries that are coming from that. Why are we trying to mirror it necessarily? Is it just about the money? I think there are lots of things we need to think about before we do some of these big overarching, very impactful changes. And I think there are lots of small changes that we could really get going with that might appear a small change, but could actually have a bigger impact. As you say, things like wording, things like access to infrastructure, even things like, this is another one of my little bugbears, a bit like the ladies team, which also annoys me. If you go on a website and it says first team and then it says women's, it's like, well, okay, you mean men's first team and women's first team, don't you? You could just change that. That's an easy fix. So just those little things about, I guess, respect more than anything, respect and value for women's football would be really impactful.
With the wording and stuff, see, this is where my mind is lit up, and Freya's probably going, oh no, where's he going? With the recent WSL rebranding and all that, and we were quite critical of it on the podcast, but it struck me that some of the wording and some of the ways they tried to sell it was the kind of thing that you looked at and went, are we stuck in like 2010? Because there's things like, I don't know, better without balls or something was one of the lines, and you're just kind of sat there going, have we not moved past this already?
Who are we marketing to?
Who are we marketing to? Do you think that sometimes with the growth of the game and the speed of the game, the people in charge don't really have an idea how to market it, and the sometimes trying to say, oh, it's different to the men's game, but they don't know how to separate it without falling back on all the kind of stereotypes.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think that is a concern, and I think probably since the launch of the WSL, certainly there was a focus then at marketing the women's game to teenage girls and younger. And I think that's actually a fallacy that a lot of us fall into. And, we see all these kind of conversations about the Lionesses being inspirational. They're so inspirational to young girls. They're great role models. And all of that may be true, but that's not all they are. They're not just there to inspire little girls. They're there because they're top athletes, and watching top class sport is surely attractive to a whole range of people who are not just little girls. And yeah, I think you're right. I think we're kind of falling through. I think we're falling between two stools at the moment. There's this kind of historical focus on marketing to teenage girls, and that kind of, maybe it seems a bit cliche to us because it's not being aimed at us. Maybe that's an argument that's worth putting forward. But I think probably there's a broader audience that is being attracted to women's football now, and I guess we have to be careful not to alienate them as well with some of the tone of some of the communications.
Do you think as well that female footballers are being held to a much higher standard because of this idea of being role models for young girls? Like, obviously, when Jill Scott swore during the last Euros, everybody loved it. People who, as football fans, you loved it. It's like, there's passion, that's proper, but you had lots of debate over it. And now Chloe Kelly is getting a ton of stick just seemingly for being a confident young woman who occasionally swears on telly when she celebrated the Euros.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think female athletes, or actually I think women in general, do get held to a different standard to their male equivalents. And I think I have written about this in my other life as an academic, about this kind of role model narrative. And I think in a lot of ways, female athletes love being role models because a lot of them talk about they never felt that they had visible sporting role models themselves when they were younger. So they might have, watched, track and field athletics, and they might have, admired a sprinter, but they didn't have necessarily female footballing role models. Or if they were cricketers or the rugby players, if they were in a male dominated sport, they didn't necessarily have the female role models. So they do welcome that in some ways, but I do think that perhaps the wider public hold female athletes to different standards. No one would expect Man City's men's players to do an autograph alley straight after a game and spend hours and hours and hours signing all the autographs, and then complain on social media because their kid didn't get the selfie that she wanted. We wouldn't expect that necessarily from men's game, and if we did, we probably wouldn't talk about it in the same way. And I think you're absolutely right about the Chloe Kelly thing. I was talking about that with my husband yesterday. The way that they are held to a different standard, the fact that confidence in a woman is always perceived as arrogance, that there's this expectation that women should be presented themselves as kind of humble and grateful and just kind of brushing off any accolades or adulation. Yeah, it's a very odd and old-fashioned view, I think, in a lot of ways of women and women's sport.
And it's so hard, isn't it? Because you've got people who, particularly like yourself and, the rise of kind of podcasts like ours, and more people who are trying to shine a spotlight on what the reality is as a female, not just in the game, but in the world, and how, those lines are so blurred between how we expect to treat women and how we perceive them. And it's hard when there's a wall, isn't there? Especially on social media, we talk about kind of one social media channel in particular being quite a cesspit at the moment, with a barrage of hate. And you're just saying, if you've got people like Chloe Kelly who can stand up and be proud of what they've achieved and not let that affect them, and we need more people like that, don't we, as role models? And speaking, going back slightly to your book, are there any stories in particular that you came across in flying the flag that kind of really hooked you in, or you thought this is the incredible story that needs to be told? Did you have any favorites?
Oh my
when researching?
goodness, like all of them. I mean, all of them. I mean, being able to, I mean, these were just the ones that kind of I wanted to follow up for this book, but there are so many more that I could have told. I mean, the first chapter talk about Jeannie Allett, who was one of the first Lionesses, and she basically packed up and left Crewe or near Crewe when she was a teenager, and she moved to the Netherlands, and she's still there now. You know, this is kind of 50 odd years later, and she's just been out there, ever since. She actually played for the Netherlands because obviously nobody kept records, and she was so young when she played in that first England team. And so, yeah, she played for the Netherlands in the 70s and 80s, and she played alongside Serena Wiegman, and it's just like, this is just an awesome story, and it kind of spans so many decades as well. But then, coming a little bit closer to today, talking to someone like Karen Farley, who spent so much of her career in Sweden and who was a superstar while she was over there. The way that she talks about it, kids running down the street asking her for autographs. She was a proper celebrity when she was in Sweden, and that was kind of a good 20 years before the WSL started. So I guess in a lot of ways, nothing is really new. It's just the way that it's being presented is new, and it's just different to us because we're so far behind when it comes to women's football, whereas some of these other countries were pretty far ahead.
Yeah, because the talent in the Swedish league still to this day has always been incredible, but because the lack of media coverage, people are just starting to really look into this league, and people might know Hammarby, and they might know Brannan Hacken, and you just think that there are so many players out there who when you get to tournaments like the Euros, like the World Cup, and you start to think, oh, they're good, where do they play? And suddenly, because there's so much coverage, you can start to find out more about these players, and of course through books like yours chronicling this history, then it's not lost, because we've seen even trying to get records of lower down the pyramid, it is so incredibly difficult, and you've got to know the right people, you've got to know the exact thing to type in if you're doing an online search, because I've tried to contact different clubs to get an insight on what's going on and their promotion and their story and things, and it's so incredibly difficult. So just about your research, how did you find it? Was it difficult to get this information?
Yeah, I mean, for this one, I guess I was very fortunate in that obviously I'm a little way down the road in kind of doing this kind of work now. So it tends to be kind of word of mouth that has been able to put me in touch with people. Karen Farley I've known for many years. Then because people kind of might recognize my name as someone that they can trust to tell a historical story relatively accurately. They're kind of like, yeah, we'll talk to her. So it's not necessarily, even though I might be contacting people cold, they'll know that I'm an okay person to talk to. It's not just someone just kind of like floating a line and seeing whether they'll bite. But getting hold of Jeannie Allett, I never thought I'd be able to speak to her because, say, she's been in Rotterdam for 50 years and she doesn't really do the reunions necessarily. She's not really interested in kind of reliving the glory days. She's still in touch with the rest of the 1972 squad, but she's not really interested in going through the history. But one of her 1972 teammates who I'd spoken to previously, I dropped her a message and I said, do you think Jeannie would talk to me? She said, I don't know, I'll ask her. 5 minutes later, my phone rang and it was Jeannie. And I was just
wow.
And Jeannie is amazing, but she's incredibly passionate about the things that she's passionate about. And she was very excited to talk to me. And I was like, brilliant. Okay, I'll fly over and talk to you. She's like, are you mad? Are you going to fly up to Rotterdam and talk to me? It's like, yes, I am. Would it be okay if I came on these dates? She's like, yeah, brilliant. I'll drive to Dordrecht station, pick you up. Okay, great.
Wow.
And we had the greatest couple of days, but it was so much fun to talk to her. But yeah, as I say, word of mouth, and I guess I'm very lucky. But there were a couple of people I did want to talk to who didn't want to tell their stories, which is absolutely fine. Of course, it's their right and their privilege not to. But so I don't get 100% success rate, but I'm very fortunate that I had so much success with getting the people that I did talk to.
Yeah, and creating fantastic connections as well. Paul, were you going to say something there?
I was going to ask, because you said some people didn't want to tell their stories, and going back to Unsuitable for Females, because the thing that fascinated me a bit is there's been some talk recently about the likes of Lily Parr and Bella Ray, and people have tried to talk a little bit more about that, but nobody really knew their stories probably really until you wrote about them. And it's interesting reading the story, because you get the sense there's almost some people who don't want to talk about certain aspects and certain questions of her life, like the bit where they were talking about her living with other women, and some people have tried to turn it into, obviously with women's football being what it is and very open to all genders and sexualities, people have tried to turn her into some sort of heroine. People going, oh, we don't want to do that, reluctance. Are there have you found resistance from certain people where you've asked questions and people have just said, don't want to talk about that?
Not really. If they've agreed to talk to me, it's people have been very open and happy to talk about things. I mean, there have been some people, and they've been, when I've gone back to it, I think maybe they're too open, and I've gone back and said, are you happy for me to put this in a book? How about maybe we
Moderate it.
not maybe put it in a slightly more diplomatic way, or maybe don't put this quote in verbatim. So that kind of thing. But in terms of the kind of the historical stuff, for the people who aren't here to speak for themselves, I think that's a slightly different issue. Someone like Lily Parr, like the Emma Clark stories that are circulated, it's difficult to know how those people would actually feel about their stories. That AI version of Lily Parr that they did a few months back, that was terrifying, and I thought actually really bad, really not a good thing to do, because you're essentially putting words into someone's mouth, and I don't think that's a great thing to do. We don't know what she would think about these things. We don't necessarily know what she would say about these things. And to kind of capitalize on her image and what I call in Unsuitable for Females, the myth of this superstar legend, it made me very uneasy. So some of those stories that can't be told by the individuals, I do think we have to take care. And I understand why people want to tell particular stories, and I understand, of course, particularly someone's writing fiction, that some things lend themselves to being pieced together and telling a particular story. But I think as journalists, as historians, we have a slightly different responsibility, if that makes sense.
Do you think women's football does enough to recognise people that have gone before still? Because obviously there's been discussion about some of the 1972 England players and some of the previous ones that still haven't been recognised by the FA, or they've had wrangles about. When you write about a few like Sylvia Gord, that's kind of, they're almost unknown because nobody's mentioned them, and they were incredible people and players. And I've always thought of things like maybe the WSL Cup should be the Lily Parr Trophy or something like that, just to kind of properly note it. And I remember there was outrage earlier on this year where when Jonas Eidevall left Arsenal, Vic Akers did an interview and said, oh, I thought he was going to talk to me and he didn't. And everybody lost their minds about how disrespectful Jonas Eidevall was. Do you think women's football, and obviously with the books that you're writing, do you think you feel a responsibility to educate people about what's come before? Because people nowadays, all the focus is on the past few years. People almost forget that there was a WSL pre maybe 2020 even.
I mean,
Arsenal talked about.
I think that's certainly true. I guess working backwards from what you were saying there, I mean, I don't necessarily feel a didactic purpose in what I'm doing. I don't necessarily feel like I need to educate people, but I want to be able to say, hear of these stories and I think they're important. I can't necessarily make people read them, but I think it's important to have that history there and being told, because if you don't know where you've come from, how can you know where you're going? I think that's really important. And yes, I think some of that modern history, the likes of Vic Akers and what Arsenal were doing before the launch of WSL. Before that, looking at a team like Doncaster Bells, what they were doing, Croydon in the early 80s, even lower stuff that I talk about, Unsuitable for Females. These teams whose stories do have echoes for today, for modern football. It's not, some of their experiences in terms of kind of finance, in terms of travel, in terms of support from men's clubs. All this stuff is still relevant now. It's not like it's ancient history, and it can be a cautionary tale. And in terms of like a little bit further back, you mentioned Sylvia Gore. Of course, she's no longer with us, but she was kind of, before she died, she was starting to take this ambassador role with Man City, and I think perhaps her story would be much better known now had she stayed with us, unfortunately. So yeah, she's a great loss, because of course she was an amazing coach as well, and she coached Wales for a long time. So I imagine she'd have been all over the television this summer as a former England player and a former Wales manager. But yeah, I think it's really easy, and again, this ties into what we were just saying. It's really easy to focus on a couple of stories, and they're the ones that we kind of because we haven't got necessarily this depth of history about women's football. People probably know the Lily Parr name, but there are so many other players and stories that we could be talking about. It's just that we haven't got that name recognition yet. So maybe that's something that will start changing over the next 10 years or so, because I think the Lionesses and Serena Wiegman have been really careful about paying tribute to the generations that have gone before, and it's one of the things that I really like about the way that they operate and the way that they recognize that in 2022 as well. Of course, they now all have their legacy caps if they played for an official team, but we still don't know necessarily if all the data is 100% accurate. I think we're probably 99% accurate when it comes to England, but in terms of domestic appearances and goals, yeah, we're still a long way off having decent records. So yeah, we have to make do with what we've got, and then make sure we're doing better into the future.
Yeah, 100%. And as historians, especially modern historians, it's about getting that human element, isn't it? Because for a long time it was just piecing together sources from a particular part of society. And I was archaeologist for a few years, and so to bring that human aspect of it just marries everything together, doesn't it? And you get the full picture, not just glimpses of what's happened. And speaking about the Lionesses and what they've done, especially for football in this country, in terms of the media coverage and the fan base, and in the league, and for you, someone who's been covering them for such a long time, over 10 years since the first book, and you just think, how does that feel from where they were now getting to write and record where they are now? Did you might have dreamed it, but did you think this could be the reality, back-to-back winners?
No. I when I first started out, I would never have thought England would have won a major trophy. Certainly not when I was still writing about it. Back to 2005 and the first Euros that I wrote about, it was in England. No one cared. No one was watching. I don't even think some of the games were on television. It's just crazy to think that how things have changed and the contrast. I mean, before the final this summer, I was exchanging voice notes with a couple of colleagues who were also covering women's football at that time, and we were kind of saying, do you remember this match? Do you remember being in this press conference? And do you remember being in this stand where there was literally nobody else there? And the fact that we're all kind of still around writing about this, and things are so different, and we have like a generation of journalists and reporters who are covering this, and they don't know anything different, which is amazing in so many ways, but just so bewildering in others. The fact that this is recent history, and 2005, people would the fact that we had a 2022 Euros when we had sold out stadia, and then we had England actually winning it. 2005, England were not great. It was at small stadia in the northwest. There was not high attendances. I don't think people would have known it was happening unless they were literally living next door. The contrast is amazing.
Yeah, and even I think 2018, 17, 18 maybe, I remember going to the Bescott Stadium in Walsall. I was living in Birmingham at the time, and it was England friendly, and there were maybe 300 of us, maybe, just at one side of the stadium, wasn't even full. And you just think, a few years, just under 10 years, the leaps and bounds, and to document that must be an incredible feeling. And kind of where do you see the Lionesses going next? Do you reckon World Cup's on the cards in the next couple of tournaments?
I hope so. I really hope so. That would be amazing. I think it's really heartening actually now, because I remember in 2022 I was asked to do quite a lot of local radio immediately afterwards, after England's win, to kind of give some context. And then the way they were talking, it was like, women's football has arrived. This is it. And I'm just like, this is not it. This is just like, we're going to stop. But this is a starting off point. This cannot be it. This is just there has to be a kick up the backside to do some more. And obviously England have. And I think it's great that we're now going, are they going to win the World Cup? Is Serena Vegan going to sign a new contract? What's the squad going to look like? Will Lucy Bronze still be there in 2 years' time? Will she be there for another Euro cycle? Probably, yeah. But the fact that we're already kind of talking about the future and the goals that are still on the horizon, I think that's brilliant. It's not kind of like, oh, well done, girls, they've won a trophy. That's women's football done. Tick, we'll tick that off now.
Yeah, they've done that now.
And it's now part of this conversation. It's part of the sporting conversation. We're talking about those cycles. It's not just about one tournament. It's about the next one and the next one and the next one, just as men's football's always had, just as men's sport in general always has. And I think that is a real indicator that we're doing something right, that we have nearly arrived.
Oh, I love it. And you've even, from this Euros as well, you've then got the Welsh FA as well going, look what your team can do with minimal investment in comparison, really. Look at where your team can get to. Let's keep pushing, let's keep going. And it's that attention that's good on these federations, isn't it? To be like, right, come on, step up. Now's your time. You can get there. Keep pushing. Keep going.
I think Wales is a really interesting case study, because I interviewed Nia Davis, the under-19s head coach, shortly before the Euros, and she was out as part of the technical team this summer. And the FAW's set up, they have fewer resources, less money, fewer professional clubs, so they don't have necessarily the same kind of stuff as England has to call on. And she was talking about kind of the way they have to be smarter about identifying talent, because the Adran Premier in Wales is not a fully professional league. So if your top Welsh players want to play professionally, they're not going to be in Wales. So it's kind of like, how are they going to keep an eye on them? How are you going to kind of have a pathway for your best young players, because you're probably not going to keep them in Wales? How are you going to keep an eye on them? What's the best route for them? And I think that's actually kind of more challenging perhaps than it would be somewhere like England, where you've got all the resources right on your doorstep.
And it's getting that infrastructure, and hopefully now it's been that wake-up call. As you said, we saw English players leaving for other countries because it wasn't possible in England. So hopefully now Wales are on that path as well, to be like, right, it starts with professionalization. It starts with giving our players the best, and then they don't have to worry about anything else, like their accommodation, like their wages. Can they pay their rent this month? And they can focus solely on being the highest level of professional footballer that they can be. It's exciting, isn't it? It's exciting these next couple of years. Now, before we go, Paul, did you have anything else you wanted to ask?
I was going to pick up. It's really interesting. A few moments ago, you said the women's football is starting to arrive, even after England have won 2 major tournaments. Because if you listen to the way the BBC talk about it, the way ITV talk about it, the way the WSL are trying to talk about it, it's here and it's massive and everybody loves it and all this sort of thing. But obviously, we know, we've talked on the podcast, you've talked about how we still have issues with teams like Blackburn this summer. Even Barcelona are currently suffering because the men's team are deciding, right, okay, we need to save money, so rather than affect the men's team, we'll dismantle our women's team. Which I find particularly interesting because everyone's kind of put them up as this is the model that everyone has to follow, and it's fallen apart very quickly. But do you find that saying it hasn't arrived yet, it's starting to arrive, it's almost an unpopular thing at the moment because everyone wants to say, well, England have won 2 Euros now and we're all supporting women's football and it's amazing. And if, you saying it's starting to arrive kind of heartened me a bit, because if someone as influential as you is saying, no, it's not, the accepted narrative of we're here isn't true, we've only just started. Do you think there's some people, I know I'm rambling a bit, but do you think some people are almost gone, okay, right, England have won 2 Euros, the job is done, the game is here now, everybody's going to watch sellout stadiums at Arsenal, Manchester City, Chelsea, so the job's done. We just let it kind of build from there.
Yeah, I think I'll come back to what I said at the start. I think it's partly because I am a bit of a dinosaur, but I also kind of feel a bit like I'm the voice of doom sometimes. I'm always like, remember what happened 5 years ago, remember what happened 10 years ago, 15, 20. You mentioned
You and I would
men's
get on
clubs.
very well on the podcast then. I'm like that as well.
But you mentioned men's clubs cutting their budgets and therefore women's teams have to suffer. That has been something that's happened in women's football ad infinitum. As soon as women's teams attach to a men's football team, there's always a concern that they will not be a priority. And we saw it in 2007 when Charlton men got relegated. They cut the women adrift straight away. Now they did go back in because they got separate sponsorship, but the automatic response was to that's going to be our cost saving. And it's one of the reasons that I've always been very kind of nervous about this push towards encouraging women's teams to affiliate with men. Now, it does obviously make sense in terms of infrastructure, in terms of having access to a ground, having access to the resources that you have within an already established football club. But women will probably never be a priority. And so one of the things that I've been doing in over the past year is I've started to facilitate this network for independent clubs, women's independent clubs across the UK. And it's nothing formal, but we meet kind of every 6 weeks or so, and I bring them all together on a Zoom call, and they talk about kind of best practice and challenges and things that are going right, things that are going wrong, because there aren't that many women's independent clubs operating at a reasonably high level, unless it's across the UK. But the ones that have really interesting experiences, interesting things to say about the way that they're experiencing football, particularly in this time of boom. So I think that's something that's precious in women's football. It's something that has a long history, and it's something that I think should be supported. And we shouldn't necessarily, as I've said, rush towards mirroring the men's game, because I don't think it's necessarily going to be good for the women.
Do you think that there is a model where independent clubs can thrive without, London City, who everyone will present this year as the amazing independent club who are taking on the might of the Premier League with only the backing of a billionaire behind them? Do you think there's a model for clubs like Lewis is the one that always gets kind of pulled out as the main one, but lots of other ones at tier 3, tier 4 who can thrive and perhaps get up towards Championship, even WSL level? Or do you think that there is a ceiling being put in place already by the way that clubs are spending?
Yeah, I think there is a way that independent women's clubs can thrive. Obviously, independent there is in inverted commas. It can cover a multitude of things. So yes, London City Lionesses are not attached to a men's club, and that is generally the way that we use independent. If you're not attached to a men's club, then you're independent. But yes, obviously they are part of part of a billionaire's portfolio. So yeah, maybe not that independent. Obviously, Lewis is a men's and women's football club. I think they're quite special in the way that they operate. But, you know, we see Glasgow City in Scotland, for example. We see, you know, tier 3, tier 4, tier 5 in England. Yes, budgets for the big Premier League affiliated clubs are probably bigger, but, you know, the independents are still in there. They're still scrappy. They're still doing okay. So I think as long as they are not priced out of the game, I think a lot of the issues around licensing in terms of infrastructure, in terms of kind of ground facilities and that kind of stuff, that's often the concern. But as long as they're supported to operate in the women's football pyramid, yeah, I think there's certainly still a place for them.
Do you think that there needs to be almost a limit on women's football growth to stop it growing too quickly, to allow these independent clubs to kind of thrive as well? And so you've got this strong base and this strong infrastructure across more than just a few clubs at the top of the pyramid.
See, I've always been one who argues for slower, more cautious, sustainable growth. I'm just quite a naturally cautious kind of person. That's just what I prefer. I think the policy more recently has been for quicker growth, and I understand why they're capitalizing on the interest now and pushing for it now. So maybe there's a happy medium. I think a big, quick push at the top end will likely end up cutting off clubs, not necessarily just independent ones, but ones further down the pyramid, because financially they won't be there to sustain it. So I think if we're looking at creating sustainable women's football pyramid at all levels, then we need to kind of take that holistic view rather than just looking at attendances and sponsorships right at the top level.
Yeah. And I was talking to Real Bedford's captain, Gemma Biggerdike, the other day, and she said, she was talking to someone else, and they said, you know, raising the ceiling but not raising the floor. And I think that's exactly it with women's football at the minute. It's very much, look what we can do at this end, but you need to be careful not to alienate and isolate those who are struggling to get fans through the door, who are struggling to get the revenue, because at the end of the day, we need to make sure the footballers are taken care of and the clubs are taken care of. And that's, you know, something for the FA to kind of really look at and think, right, how do we make this sustainable football pyramid? Yeah.
One of the things I always bang on about is it's not just about the Lionesses. It's not just about Arsenal. It's not just about Chelsea. And one of the things I will always wave a flag for is the right for women to play terrible recreational football just as much as men always have. I'm absolutely in favour of rocking up at the Rec on a Sunday morning and being terrible and getting beaten 10-0, because if you're enjoying it, that's what's important.
Exactly.
It's not just about, you know, winning trophies at the top end. It's about all the other great stuff, the friendship, fitness, teamwork, negotiation, diplomacy, travel, all the other great stuff that you get from being part of a football team. And yeah, I want women and girls to have that too.
Yeah, and without grassroots, where would our Lionesses come from? So yeah, I absolutely need to make sure everyone's taken care of. And you know, Carrie, we could speak to you all day. And thank you so much for giving us so much of your time already. Are there any new projects in the works you can maybe tell us about, or what are you up to at the moment?
I am throwing around some ideas. I may have started writing a couple of paragraphs already, but I'm not quite sure where they're going to go yet. But yeah, there are some ideas. Watch this space.
Fantastic. Well, you are more than welcome back on the pod at any time to talk about anything that you're currently doing, because again, we could talk to you about all these stories all day. And where can people find you across social media if they want to keep up to date with new releases and things like that?
I'm not on Twitter anymore, which is sad because it's awful. So you can find me on LinkedIn, or you can find me on Instagram at Carrie Sparkle 123.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And for everyone watching and listening to this podcast, thank you so much. And if you do want to find more from the podcast, we've got brand new thumbnails for all our shows starting in September. Remember, we are live every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday with our women's football podcast live 8:30 on a Wednesday. And you can see all of our socials there. Of course, bringing you all the latest news from the world of football in general, with club episodes, interviews, and much, much more. So do keep notifications on, and you'll find more interviews like the one with the lovely Carrie we've had today. So thank you so much. Thank you to Paul as well. Thank you, mate, for joining me this afternoon. And thank you once again to Carrie. And we will see you all very, very soon. Thank you. Hi everyone, Freya here. Thank you so much for watching the Absolute Football Podcast. Please don't forget to hit like, share, subscribe, follow, love, whatever you need to do to make sure you don't miss a single moment. Remember, you can watch one of the videos that are on screen now. And don't forget, of course, our women's football show, the Absolute Women's Football Show, is live every single Wednesday at 8:30 with yours truly and a fantastic panel. Join me each week and special guests as well. So remember to like and subscribe, and hopefully we'll see you in the chat next Wednesday.